I wanted to introduce our next speaker. Logan's going to be discussing 8 ways to get through a door. I met Logan at KiwiCon end of last year, where he gave a well-received talk towards the end of the conference. I think it was server room selfies, if I recall correctly. So yeah, I'm going to pass over to Logan. Oh, and Logan is also from Aura, who are one of our sponsors. So double thanks to them. Thank you to Logan.
Thanks, Clippus. All right, hi everyone. It's great to be back at my second OzSecCon, and for some reason they've accepted another one of my interpretive dance performances. A little bit about me first. I'm Logan. I'm a senior consultant at Aura Information Security across the ditch. My specialty is physical security and gaining access to places that I shouldn't be in. This has led to me having a probably unhealthy interest in making doors open. All right, doors. Hands up if you've never used one. Down the back. How'd you get in? Like the window? I don't know. Okay, not much explanation of a door required, but long story short, in a physical security setting, they're generally used for access control between areas that have different security requirements. And in order to enforce your access restrictions on these areas, a door needs some sort of device that either allows or prevents someone or something from opening that door. And all of these devices, to some extent, can be attacked in one way or another. So as a physical security red team, our goal is often to either gain access to an area or facility, or to gain access to information or an asset that is kept within a secure area. In almost every case, this means we have to get past one or more doors. There's a pretty broad range of door security vulnerabilities, and it's important for a red team to be able to quickly identify which of these a particular door is susceptible to and how they may be able to exploit that. And today I'll be covering several of these vulnerabilities, from some really mundane ones to some quite complex ones. And hopefully you'll all learn some new ways to get a door open, or some things that you need to be aware of if you're on the team that's meant to be keeping the doors shut. And importantly, these attacks are all either non or minimally destructive, and that's because generally our customers kind of know that you could kick the door in, so they don't need that demonstrated to them. This talk contains some real footage and imagery from some engagements I've been involved in. I'm hopeful that I've redacted these sufficiently, and if I haven't, don't look too closely. So for each door opening technique, I'll talk a little bit about the underlying cause and technical background of that door vulnerability, how to identify a door that's vulnerable, and how to exploit that particular issue. And then I'll give some of my thoughts about, from a red team perspective, about how a technique is good, what some of its flaws are, and how it could be prevented by the blue team. Right, let's kick this off with some fireworks. This technique's like madness. On one engagement against a critical national infrastructure provider, 75% of sites that we targeted were exploited using this technique, and that's crazy. It's so devastating that before this con, I spent several hours coming up with an NSA-style acronym for it. All right, here we go. It's Operational Protocol for Entrance Negation, Secure Entry Systems All Made Easy, Open Sesame. When you find a door that's vulnerable to this technique, it's game over. No matter how good their access control system is, how badass the lock is, whatever, it's done. You're going through that door. Yeah, sorry. You know what, I wasn't kidding about that engagement where 75% of sites that we attempted to gain access to had unlocked doors. At one of them, I actually picked the lock on the side door, but I picked it to more locked. And while I was trying to pick it back the other way, my colleague was like, "Oh, Logan, the front door's unlocked. Put that away. Get in here." If you've ever seen CCTV footage of people doing theft out of cars, the first thing they do is rock up and pull the door handle. These guys, they're dirtbags, but they kind of know what they're doing, and they're not going straight in with some crazy bypass technique. They'll just try the door. So detecting this issue is sometimes really easy. In the most obvious cases, either the door will already be ajar, or there may be some sort of good visual indicator that the door is not secure. And that might be like a card reader that has a green LED on it, or the reader might be beeping a lot, which is what some access control systems do to indicate that the door security mechanism hasn't engaged. Mag locks, those big bricks at the top of a door, they'll often have a bond indicator, a bond strength indicator that will change color depending on whether the door thinks it's latched or not. And on close inspection of like a mechanical door latch, you can often see if the tongue or bolt is actually present in the door gap. The primary way to identify this issue is just to walk up and try the door handle. Keep in mind that if you try a door handle and the door doesn't open, and then you're like, and just like walk off. If anyone sees that, they're going to be like, wow, that was sketchy as hell. Like, that's when you need to have a pretext. So exploiting this issue, right? Step 1, you open the door. Step 2, there's no step 2. That's it. You're in. So this is one of my favorite issues to find on a physical security job, if only because of the fun that you have when you deliver it to the customer. They hear about this in your sort of delivery meeting, and half of them just start laughing. The other half either look like they're going to cry or maybe vomit. And usually that's because it's their team that was responsible for locking the doors in question. It's also a very good indicator if you show up to a location that's has unlocked doors, that they won't be using the other security controls they might have, like an alarm system. And just keep in mind that if you're doing a multiple day engagement and you show up and you're doing your recon and you find an unlocked door, don't assume that that door will still be unlocked when you come back the next night, for example, to gain access. It may just be that like someone was sloppy once and some more diligent people have done their lockup the next day. And the best way to mitigate this issue is really like to have door systems that will lock themselves, either all of the time or have them on a schedule if you need public access at some times of day. And this helps to eliminate human error, like people just forgetting to lock up. It doesn't stop awesome things like staff wedging the door open with a fire extinguisher or leaving the bathroom doors open, the bathroom window open when they leave at the end of the day. And so, there is a little bit more to this technique. Often interior doors that use mag locks, they just use these tiny little cheap mag locks. They're about like that big, and they don't have a whole lot of bond strength. A sharp push or pull on these doors will often pop them open. And sometimes even on the big proper mag locks, this technique will work if the mag lock has been installed in such a way that it's not making good contact and getting full bond strength. Just be aware that if you do pop a door with a mag lock like this, you'll often cause what's called a forced door alert. You'll hear me talking about this a little bit on any access control system on that door. And that can have, the results of that can range from nothing at all happening to like a manned security desk getting an alert saying, level 2 server room door has been forced. Also, again, like with trying the door handle, if someone sees you putting a shoulder into a door and then like looking awkward and shuffling away, it's going to look a lot like you're trying to break into the building. So here, if I can do this right. Yes, here's an example of a mag lock that wasn't making full contact and as a result was susceptible to being jarred by a sharp pull on the door. Go, internet. It's really short, sorry. I mean, it's a door opening, like, hey. Yeah. So that's as you can see there, the mag lock's got a red light on it indicating that it hasn't made full bond strength. The door also had a handle, which was convenient for pulling on it quite hard, and it's just a short, sharp kind of thump that will often pop those open. Back over here. Okay, so you rock up and all the doors are locked. Like that happens a bit. So what if you could just get someone to unlock the door for you? Like without even asking them, you just follow them at a not too creepy distance. You let them do whatever the thing is that unlocks the door, and then just before the door closes behind them, you catch the edge of the door and you let yourself in, and it's super easy. Tailgating is an extremely effective way of gaining access to secure facilities. When it's executed carefully and confidently, only the most highly security aware organizations are actually going to hit you up. The major problem with tailgating from my perspective is that there's a huge unknown, and that's the security awareness of the individual that you're attempting to tailgate. And there'll often be some good indications that tailgating is likely to be successful. Any organization where none of the staff that you see outside are wearing identification, that's probably a good start. There's two caveats to that, and the first is some organizations are just so small that everybody knows each other, so they don't have the need to wear ID, and tailgating's not going to be good there because they'll just immediately be like, who the hell are you? The other one is some places that have quite high security awareness, all the staff wear ID inside the building, and then they're really diligent about removing their ID before they leave the building, and that's another one that will catch you out quite badly. But a mixture of staff, some of whom are wearing ID and some of whom aren't, that's almost ideal. That means that there's like inconsistent behavior in that organization and that they're unlikely to hit you up if you don't have ID. A slightly more advanced method, if the staff generally do have very visible, very obvious ID, is to produce something that looks quite similar, like get a similar colored lanyard and then some random swipe cards and put them in a sleeve and whatever. And then wear it so that it's partially obscured or difficult for someone to inspect at a glance. Some people, they might hesitate when like holding a door for a stranger when you're going for a tailgate, but when they see this like definitely real deal, totally authentic lanyard that's just like sticking out the top of your jacket, usually they'll just be like, oh yeah, cool, and I'll just hold the door for you. And there's some technical factors in certain facilities that will make tailgating easier. Things like automatic door closers that are really, really slow. These are sometimes set up for like convenience or accessibility issues, and they make it really easy because people just walk off and assume the door will close itself, but you've let yourself in the interim. The other one that I really like is those lift systems where you show up in the lobby and there's a touch screen and you like dial the floor you want and present your access card. And then when the lift arrives at the lobby, it has like, it's like the menu at a restaurant. I'm like, oh, which floor do I want to go to today? Like, yeah, 10, cool, because it's just displayed on the side of the lift, and you're just like, yeah, I know it's going to my target floor. I know you've already swiped, but you have no idea that I haven't, and you have the secure lift system, so like it's definitely okay, right? And once you've decided that you're going to go for a tailgate, there's a couple of factors that will help you to succeed with it. And the first, which should be applied just about every time you go for a tailgate, is to appear to be a little bit distracted. At the very least, you should appear to be fixated on like Twitter or email or something like that on your cell phone, or even better is to actually be on a phone call. And it's, ideally you'll have someone on the other end of the phone call, so you're not just doing the like, yes, Mr. President, right away, Mr. President, kind of like, it's quite hard to fake a phone call. But you can actually, if you're jumping in a lift, you can do that whole thing, which I'm sure you've either done or seen a million times, where you're like, oh, hang on, I'm just getting in a lift. Oh, are you there? Are you there? Oh man, come on. And basically the other person in the lift will be like, what an egg. Like everyone knows cell phones don't work properly in the lift, you dumbass. And so they'll sort of leave you alone because you're like that awkward, stupid guy. But you're like, hey, you're gonna let me in. And this works even better if you can get in with a big group of people who might be going to different floors and whatever, and they're all from the target organization. It exploits a natural tendency of people to regard potential issues as being someone else's problem if they have the opportunity. Also, make sure that you have a rough idea of what's going to be on the other side of that door once you get in. And this is where like doing your OSINT and whatever you can to find out what that building looks like on the inside is really important. Because if you wander in and you just look completely lost, that's a really good opportunity for someone to be like, excuse me, can I help you? Do you work here? Do I need to call the police? Like, yeah. And tailgating, it's a great way to gain entry to a lot of facilities, especially ones that are using quite good technical controls, like a good access card system or good locks, that kind of thing, because these are all completely bypassed by the legitimate person that you're following in. And when you tailgate into a building, you can almost guarantee that any other security controls on the other side of that door will already be disarmed. Like, it's quite, you wouldn't tailgate someone at 2 o'clock into a building and then have them disarm the alarm. The building's going to be populated with people. But that's kind of that's like a double-edged sword, because once you get into that building, you're inside a building full of people. There's a chance that someone else in there is going to challenge you. You can't just walk up and start like, using some of these other attacks that I'll talk about on their server room door or something like that. So you end up having to like hide in their toilet for 4 hours until everybody leaves, unless you can just kind of slip like a, some sort of backdoor tool and something like that. The other thing that's a big unknown with tailgating that I mentioned is that you have no idea of the security awareness of your mark. You may have like totally done your recon, you might have your fake lanyard, you're totally prepped and ready to roll on this tailgating attempt, but it just so happens that the one person that you go after is like the most tinfoil hat wearing paranoid person in that workplace, and as soon as you hop in the lift with them, they're like, I'm calling the police. Crap. So personally I prefer techniques where I have control over all of the variables, and that's where some of the other ones come in. Right, lockpicking. To generalize, this is basically any method where you're manipulating components of a lock cylinder in order to unlock a door. Single pin picking, raking, bypassing, impressioning, although I'm pretty sure that's like wizardry and I don't know how it works. Like, not what the guy in this image is doing. I was just like, stock image lockpicking, and there's like a guy with a spanner and a plastic cylinder, and it's like, I don't know, maybe I'm doing it wrong. So the important thing with lockpicking when you're doing it on an engagement is knowing when it's a worthwhile attack and when you should just skip it and go to something else. And first things first, if you see a wafer lock, just like pick it. Just on principle alone, like just pick it. Like why not? Only takes a few seconds. Something like a city rake or the Peterson C5 rake, they go through wafer locks like instantly. They work about as well as a key. Unfortunately, you'll mostly only find wafer locks on like desks and cupboards these days. So at that point, you're already inside the target facility, but it's still worth doing it because you find some kind of interesting stuff, in people's desk drawers, that kind of thing. The next one in this part of the world is the Lockwood C4 profile. Most of you probably have a Lockwood C4 on the front door of your house, unless you're like a massive security nerd like some of us. You see these even in commercial installations all over the place, and 99% of the time these will be a 5 or 6 pin lock. It's all standard pins, and most of them rake open very, very quickly unless they have quite a radical bitting. There's a new tool that's been developed by Tepene, who's here at this conference. It's called the Nessie, and it's been specifically designed for speedy opening on Lockwoods. It's like a combination rake hook. I'll be buying one once they've sort of become broadly available. That's like your speed entry option there. Outside of that, if you're not super, you don't really want to invest a whole lot of time in brushing up your lockpicking, tools like snap guns or the Kronos electropick or other electropicking guns. I mean, even like the $60 Chinese like Banggood electropicks actually do a pretty good job against these relatively low security locks. They're just a little less stealthy and kind of a bit harder to explain away. The other locks that are often viable for a picking attack are stuff like your master locks or other kind of common low-grade cheap locks. It pays to have a little bit of a working knowledge of like what a good lock looks like and what a cheap lock looks like, so that you know when it's actually worthwhile attacking them. And any lock that's much better than those that I've mentioned, it's probably not going to be a viable option for picking, especially locks that are known for being really good, like your Bilock and your Abloy ProTech and things like that. If you have a couple of hours uninterrupted in front of a good lock, you might be able to pick it open, but there's a reasonable chance that you'll actually have more success with another attack. Now, I've just said don't bother picking a Bilock, so here's a video of me picking a Bilock once that loads. It's a Bilock exclusive. I was quite proud of that one. The big difference is that my Bilock there, that's in a vise. It's in a well-lit, very quiet room. I had the benefit of several weeks to learn the intricacies of that lock, kind of how it picked. In the field, it's a completely different game. Like, you've got a door frame to worry about, door handles, other bits of door furniture. So they may force you to pick on an awkward angle or pick around those or tension in a different way. You might have to specifically pick the lock in a particular direction, and for some, especially higher security locks, that's a major consideration. If the lock's on the exterior of a building, or if it's like a padlock on a gate or something, there's a real good chance it will just be gunked up or full of rust or like growing moss or something, and those are really hard to pick. Like a really cheap lock that's been outside for 10 years, I'd rather pick a Bilock. It's horrible. And then you also stack on top of that you actually, when you're doing this on an engagement, you have nerves, there's pressure, there's a chance that you'll get busted. It also doesn't help when there's one or more of your colleagues standing behind you being like, "Come on, Mr. Lockpicks, I thought you said this was easy." And you're like, "Shut up." And last of all, lockpicking, you rely on a lot of tiny little visual cues. You rely on audible cues, tiny things like the core advancing a little bit, and these will disappear in the field. You just don't get them. There's background noise, that kind of thing. Though all of that said, as I found out recently, I can pick a Master Lock XL in the middle of the night in like a windy field, no problem. So summarizing lockpicking as an entry technique, against some of the locks I've mentioned, you can gain access very, very quickly, and you'll often gain access to some surprisingly juicy areas by picking a really low-grade lock. I once got access to some critical infrastructure by picking a wafer lock. It was on a sliding garage door, and those often have incredibly low-grade locks. On the flip side, most clients that I've done this on an engagement for, they don't actually consider it to be a real part of their threat model. In any scenario that you present to them where you've picked a lock, they'll be like, "Yeah, it's like spy stuff, like who cares?" So also sometimes you'll come across a lock that's just really horrible, and it might be a lock that you take a look at and you're like, "Yeah, I can pick this so fast. I would pick this in seconds." And that very same lock in a vise on your bench you might pick in under a minute. But, out in the world, you might be there for 10 minutes, and you might be in a position where 10 minutes is not a suitable amount of time to be spending stuffing around with a lock. If you do successfully pick a lock, there's always a risk that you'll damage it. Depending on the type of lock, you might like drop driver pins into the keyway. If it's a complex lock, you might drop parts into like a sidebar or something like that and completely brick the lock to the extent that a legitimate key holder can no longer operate that lock. It also makes them quite suspicious if they come along and the front door lock's broken. The other thing is that if someone does interrupt you picking a lock, like you can have all the letters of authorization in the world, but that person is probably still going to call the police because it's generally regarded as like an explicitly criminal kind of thing to be doing. And another factor is that even if you do successfully pick a lock, if you're trying to be covert about it, often you'll have to pick the lock back to closed when you've finished doing whatever you're doing, come back out. And on a particularly challenging lock, that might mean more time exposed in a position where you could get caught just trying to pick a lock closed so that you don't leave the client site insecure, which would kind of be a bit irresponsible. The mitigation for this attack is pretty simple, and it's basically to use a lock that reflects the value of the asset that you're protecting with it. It's not uncommon to see tens of thousands of dollars of stuff protected by like, a $10 just like Lockwood clone. It's like if you're buying a whole new server room of gear, go and spend $200 on a decent cylinder. So next up is shimming, slipping, loiding. There's a whole lot of names for this. Whatever you want to call it, it's an attack against doors that have a spring-loaded latch. And it's where you insert something into the door gap to pull the latch tongue back and allow the door to be opened. The name loiding actually comes from a tool that was commonly used in the past. I think it comes from like the British criminal underworld, where they used to use pieces of celluloid film to do this attack. Some doors can be opened in seconds with a successful shimming attack, and that's especially if they don't have an anti-shimming mechanism installed or if it's been installed incorrectly. And doors in that category are great. It's fairly uncommon to see doors these days that have no anti-shim mechanism at all, unless they're like residential interior doors. And that's because it's a technique that's fairly broadly known about in physical security circles. However, it's much more common to find doors with an anti-shim mechanism, and that's like the little triangle above the latch tongue that you'll see on a door lock. It's more correctly known as a deadlocking plunger. Installations where that's not functioning correctly. And so for that mechanism to work correctly, the tongue of the latch has to extend basically all the way out of the latch, while the deadlocking plunger has to stay depressed into the mortise or whatever it is. And this can go wrong if they make such a big hole in the strike plate, so in the door frame side, that when the door is closed, both the latch tongue and the deadlocking plunger both extend out into the hole. And this happens quite a lot, basically because it's quick and easy for the door installers to just put a huge hole in the frame and slam like this great big strike plate in, and they just know that the door will work. Like the door will close, and if you try it when it's locked, it won't open. But it's incredibly easy to open with a technique like this. The other case is when the door gap is so massive that the deadlocking plunger doesn't get depressed, it extends back out. And when this happens, the anti-shimming mechanism doesn't engage, and you can use a tool like the Sparrow's Quick Gym or the Hall Pass, which are very good at slipping these. And I've made a tool, I call it the stabby thing. It's that stabby thing. And so that's a cut down rafter square. You just hacksaw it off, and I've actually beveled the edge. I've made it as blunt as possible, and that's mostly so it doesn't get hung up when I'm slipping latches. And that kind of extends on the capabilities of the Quick Gym, which is that tool in the middle. It just lets you get at a few more latches and does allow, in certain circumstances, you to apply a little bit more force to the latch tongue. And doors that open away from you, they generally have the latch protected by the door frame, and they make it quite hard to actually identify that that particular latch may be vulnerable. Here's one, this is on engagement, this is just slipping it with an old credit card. Gee, it seems like a long time now, but like, yeah, there we go. So that's just an old credit card and just slipping it in, having it bend around the door frame and push the latch back in. You can use something like that, or ideally you'll get something like the proper super mica type cards, which are a lot more flexible and will slip in there. sometimes on doors that are outward opening, they'll have like a latch guard plate installed, but a tool like the stabby thing can get in behind there. There's a few other techniques. And sometimes you'll find an outward opening door that has a reasonably well installed latch that won't shim. But often it doesn't take a whole lot to get the deadlocking plunger to pop out sufficiently that the anti-shimming mechanism disengages. And if you don't mind just doing like a tiny bit of damage to the paint on the door frame, you can quite often stretch the door gap enough that that pops out and you can get the door open. So I use it's a Hart brand molding bar. They cost about $30 at Bunnings, and they have quite a wide end on them so that they spread the force on the door frame and you kind of minimize the damage that you're doing to it. And once you've made that door gap a bit bigger, you just stabby thing it and away you go. So here's one in the field. I'll get the pointy thing. That cylinder is an Abloy Protec. That's a really good lock that you're not picking unless you're Hux. So basically I put my pry bar, there we go. Put my pry bar in the gap, push the gap open a little bit more. The dead latching plunges in there, and it's actually popped out enough. And this line here is the stabby thing sliding up between the strike plate and the latch. So that door in that photo is actually you just pull it and it's open at that point. And that got access to some quite spicy stuff. So that's an open on a door that has a very, very good lock on it in under 10 seconds. And in particular, in this case, the door frame, as you can see, was already a bit rough. So no one's going to really notice if you've kind of squashed it a bit more or taken a few more chips out of the paint. Here it is again, and this one was against an electric strike. So the electric mechanism's on the door frame, and once again, large door gap, allowing this technique to work. Ooh, wow, full screen. That's exciting. Come on. Yeah, no. Oh wow, the spinny thing's awesome. I hear your NBN's like super great. Yeah, so it's that fast, and I didn't really do a great job of that at that time. Let's see if we can do this properly. Help, get me out of full screen. Yeah, technology. Okay, so shimming, it's rapidly becoming one of my favorite entry techniques. It works on a surprisingly large number of doors, especially outward opening ones that you can go and, start forcing that door gap. It gets you entry very quickly and reasonably covertly, especially if you can do it without the big stabby thing in a pry bar. If you can just slip like a credit card in or a Sparrow's Hall Pass, you can do it basically in your palm, and to a casual observer, it will appear that nothing is actually amiss. Demonstrating this vulnerability to a client is kind of fun. There's this moment where like the illusion of a locked door providing security just kind of comes crashing down, and they're like, oh wow, everything is a lie. The only significant downside is that if you have to pry on the door frame, you can do some damage, and that may or may not be in scope. And if the door frame is actually kind of compromised already, it's weather damaged or someone's filled it with bog at some stage, you could actually damage it quite badly. As I mentioned before about forced door alerts, quite often loitering attacks will cause a forced door alert on the access system. And kind of again, you really don't want to be caught doing this if you're using like a pry bar, because again, there's a sort of inherent link between someone with a pry bar having a go at a door and definite criminality. In mitigating this issue, it's not actually too hard. You can either use just a non-spring-loaded deadbolt for reasonably high security installations, or you can use a locking mechanism like a mag lock that doesn't actually have a latching mechanism. If you want to use a spring-loaded latch, it's fine. Just make sure that you're using it in a nice solid door, good solid frame, and it's installed nicely so that it minimizes the door gap so that you can't get tools in there. Also, a long latch guard plate, and I mean like basically the length of the door. Again, you're just avoiding an attacker getting tools into that door gap so that they can attack the latch. And now, those of you that have used a door before may have noticed that they can be used to both enter and exit a secure place. Generally speaking, there's not much perceived risk in allowing people to leave a secure area unless it's a prison. So to ease the user experience, many secure doors can be released from the secure side without having to use a key or another authentication token. In many cases, this functionality is actually mandated by building code, basically to prevent people being trapped inside a building inside an emergency. And this technique is about finding ways to make the door think that you're already on the secure side by making use of this request to exit functionality. So you found a door that people appear to exit fairly freely through, and this may be the public entrance to the building, and it allows free movement in either direction during the day, but you want to get through it after hours. Ideally, you'll get a look at how people are requesting to exit, and there's actually a few common types that are used. Whichever type's present, ideally there'll be a nice big door gap so that you can get whatever you're using to attack this mechanism onto the other side of the door and attempt to request to exit. Glass building entry doors are a really nice bonus because you can actually see what's going on the other side and kind of verify that you are attacking it in a meaningful way. Traditional push to exit, which I'm told is really common in Australia, it's just a momentary plain old push button switch. Often it's like a little green button. Depending on how these are installed, they can be quite tricky to actually exploit, like how far they are from the door, that kind of thing. My preference is just something like an unbent wire coat hanger, and you get that through the door gap and you kind of wiggle it around until you get it on the button and push. The next, which is becoming more common, is a contactless type. These have a variety of operating principles. Some of them you just have to wave like a piece of cardboard in front of. Some of them use capacitance and that kind of thing to detect basically like a person, so you have to introduce some sort of change of capacitance in front of them, like a conductive object. And then you've got the automatic door styles, like you'd see in a servo or a mall or something like that. We have the motion sensor above the door. Again, sometimes you can just wave a piece of cardboard in front of these, and sometimes they're a bit more clever, which I'll talk about more in just a moment. And last of all is doors where there's some hardware in the door latch, in the mortise lock, that detects when the handle is turned on the secure side and this unlatches the door. And I'll go into a lot more detail about that because there's some quite interesting attacks there. So this is an example, although it's a very brief one, of exploitation of an externally accessible push-to-exit button. Go internet. Okay, cool. Super short, sorry, there was like a lot of client identifying stuff going on there. So in that case, the door gap was so huge that I could put my whole hand through the gap between the door and the frame and just push the button, which was just around the corner. Here's another one. This is a KiwiCon schedule on the end of an under the door tool being used to trigger a contactless request to exit device. Sort of noteworthy there is the distance from which that actually triggered the contactless push to exit. We're talking like 30 centimeters away. So I'd speculate that that particular one was using possibly like a change in light level to detect when an object was in front of it. So onto some more advanced request to exit techniques. There's a fairly well-known technique where if it's using a temperature-sensitive infrared motion sensor above a door, you can use an inverted air duster can with the little straw. You put the straw through the door gap, you give it a squirt, it creates a cloud of very cold air. The infrared sensor sees a change, because those things don't actually look for like a warm thing, they just look for something being different to how it was before, and that will release the door. Another technique for triggering motion sensing techniques that aren't so temperature sensitive but are using other mechanisms of motion sensing is to inflate a balloon through the door gap and then release the balloon. It will make an awesome noise and fly all through the lobby of the building, and ideally it will trigger the motion sensor and the door release. Just bear in mind that it is quite a noisy attack, and it might be slightly suspicious if you leave this strange deflated balloon on the other side of the door if it doesn't work and you don't subsequently gain access. The crazy sort of sci-fi version of this, of requesting to exit, is against the capacitive touch contactless exit buttons. Jeremy and Ryan have developed this thing. I think they call it like the ray gun. it looks terrifying. I think it sets things on fire, but it also triggers these contactless touch to exit, like an oxymoron, contactless request to exit devices from apparently like 6 feet away, like genuinely field usable range if you can get around the like, I think it looks like a drill with an oven tray on the front, like quite frightening. This technique in its very purest form, it will get you access to a building in a manner that looks very much like you just swiped in with a card. You know, again, if someone's just walking past and you do the like reach through the gap and push the button, to them, you're there, the door unlatched, you did something, you're in the building, like everything's fine. It's a very nice one for getting after hours access to certain areas. You know, and then there's less risk of someone seeing you like waving a piece of cardboard through a door or like sending balloons around the room and stuff like that. And this brings me to the major drawback, which is most of the time, if you're seen while you're doing the exploity bit of this particular technique, like if someone actually comes and looks closely at what you're doing, it can be very clear that you're up to something strange. If you're doing something like, you know, putting a stick with a piece of cardboard through a door and waving it around, it's like, what are you doing? Mitigation of unwanted request to exit devices, unwanted request to exit events is usually not that difficult. Basically close the door gap up, whether it's like weather stripping or just like a plate of aluminium. If that's not really suitable for the situation, you relocate the request to exit device away from the door. One of the worst things from my perspective to come across on an engagement is a setup with swipe to exit. I just absolutely hate that because that means I have to exit at the target's convenience. I have to wait for a tailgate out, introduce more risk. So in a facility that has kind of heightened security requirements, swipe to exit rather than free exit is definitely something to consider. So a more specialist category of requesting to exit specifically affects doors where the locking mechanism can be released by the handle on the secure side. And these can sometimes be accessed from the insecure side by using an under the door tool, or sometimes by going over the top of the door. So first up, under the door, this is a commercial style under the door tool. I'm not sure if PicPal sells them, you know, they're not hard to get. You could probably just knock one together with some wire and a little bit of cable. The basic operation of these is you slide most of the tool under the door, and while you hold onto the ring on the end of the cable, that little guy there, you use the handle there to basically rock that end up against the back of the door, and then you rotate the entire tool so that the cable slides in behind the door handle. The door handle in a commercial building, there's a very good chance it will be like a hooked style one. This is for accessibility reasons. It's often mandated by building code. And then you just pull the cable to pull the door handle down and you gain access. The very vast majority of doors tend to have the same door handle on the inside as the outside. So when you approach a door, you know what you're going to be working with on the other side. If the door has like a window or a glass pane beside it, that can make it much easier to actually see what's going on with your under the door tool. Otherwise, there's tools like those USB bore scopes. You can buy them quite cheaply, feed that under the door, and that will just let you see what's going on the other side. You also need to find a door installation that has a little bit of a gap at the bottom. Often exterior doors will have either like significant weather stripping or a small step that will, you know, it's intended to keep water out, but it will defeat these tools quite effectively. And before you go cramming your under the door tool underneath the door, it really pays to have a look at the height of the door handle on the insecure side and then size your under the door tool basically by bending it to ensure that you're at the right height, because it saves a lot of fumbling around on the other side. And if you are going to use these things in the field, it really pays to practice a bunch with them and get to know what like the different sounds you hear through the door mean when you've hooked the door handle, you know, whether you're actually pulling on it or you're just scraping the paint off the back of the door. Some other ways that you can get at the door handle. I've seen footage of a technique where they fed a strip of film or heavy ribbon through a gap at the top of a door, and they looped it around the door handle and then used that to pull the door up. So some pull the door handle up. Some doors are set up so that lifting the handle has the same effect as turning it downward. I haven't seen that a whole lot in this part of the world. Most of the doors that I encounter, they only work on the downward direction, but like your mileage may vary. If the room has a tiled ceiling on both sides of the door, you can sometimes get something like a telescopic paint roller and go over the top of the door and use that to push the door handle down, or potentially you can spot another type of those request to exit devices and attempt to trigger that from the insecure side of the door. So going under or over the door has several of the same strengths and weaknesses as those other request to exit manipulation techniques. It's a clean and quite satisfying way of opening certain doors, but a huge consideration is you need to be absolutely certain that there is nobody on the other side of that door. Although apparently like you can get away with that in certain circumstances with MuSec. Talked about that yesterday. So having watched some of my colleagues practicing with an under the door tool with me on the other side of the door, it's like totally hilarious, but it would be terrifying if you were just some random office worker working late and this thing came under the door. I was also quite surprised by the amount of paint that an under the door tool will remove from the bottom of the door. It leaves quite a lot of like debris around the place. No one's going to see it because it's on the bottom, but the paint flecks all over the place are there. And if you are getting a bit frustrated and kind of leaning on your under the door tool, there's a chance that you'll mark the secure side of the door with the end of the tool. The tools that you use for these techniques tend to be quite unwieldy. With a bit of modification and force, you can sometimes fit them in a backpack, but often by their very nature, they're quite, it can be difficult to be surreptitious just carrying them around. The simplest mitigation for under the door techniques is actually just to use a round door handle if you can. You may be mandated by building code to use a lever door handle, in which case you'll want to block up that gap at the bottom of the door, consider the possibility of things going over the top of the door, or you can basically disable the request to exit functionality in the door handle and use an alternate request to exit device that's positioned away from the door. So next up's card cloning, and this is like the most hacker man, secret squirrel, NSA super duper way that you can get a door open. The talk this morning would have had a lot more detail about this kind of attack. I'm going to keep it reasonably high level. It is ridiculously effective in some circumstances, but there's a very good chance that any client you use it against won't care at all. So recognizing vulnerable systems. If you show up and their card readers look like this, it's HID procs, it's terrible. If you show up and they have these, like you shorten your hotel stay, you bring your flights forward, you just like, if they don't have like alarms and dogs and guns and everything, you just clone a card and then you do whatever you want. You loiter around their building entrance for a while, you scoop up a whole bunch of card data when people go to lunch. If you've done your homework on LinkedIn, you know who the head of IT is, so you wait for him to come out to get a coffee and you clone his card, and they probably have access to like the entire building. So that fire hazard is a tool called Lumpy. That's a butchered long-range HID procs card reader. It's normally used for car park exits, so it has quite nice long range so that you can swipe your card without leaning too far out of your car. That one's battery powered, it's Bluetooth enabled, it talks to Project Walrus. It's an Android card cloning app that was developed by some of my very clever colleagues. And this thing in a laptop bag makes surreptitious cloning of HID procs cards completely viable in the field. We get ranges of up to about 1 meter when cloning people, and that means you don't even have to get awkwardly close to them, you just have to walk past them. I mean, this is so well understood now, and the tools have reached that kind of maturity that this is just like commoditized ownage of it. It's trivial. But on the other hand, we're starting to see a lot more sites that are using systems like this. This particular beastie is a Gallagher T20. Unless the integrator has crippled it by either ticking all of the legacy compatibility options, or they've made some implementation mistakes that I'll hint about but not talk about today. These generally are using a cryptographic challenge and response between the card and the reader. You're not going to compromise that anytime soon. If you see a modern card system and it's not operating on 125 kilohertz, meaning it has legacy support enabled, just move on to another attack. And for this reason, a good working knowledge of common RFID systems is quite an important thing, just like locks, for a physical red teamer to maintain, because it's important to know which systems are actually going to be worthwhile going for a cloning attack and which ones you just need to move on. So this attack, it's overwhelmingly effective against vulnerable organizations. It won't open a door, it will open all of the doors. For us, it usually means server room selfies on the second night of the engagement. But the downside of this method is that the client will just say, it's not enough threat model, and they do nothing about it. One client, we showed up, we cloned cards, we got all up in every bit of their building, server room, like CEO's office, just you name it, we got in there. And over a year later, I paid their site a little visit, and they're still using HID procs. Like, they just completely discounted it as a meaningful attack against them. But what you can do is, if you do compromise a target using this technique, you gain access to everything. And what I usually do there is I go and find a really low-tech technique that they're vulnerable to, because you have that all areas access. It's very easy to find these, and then you go and demonstrate that technique to them. I mean, you still report to them that you're using HID procs and it's terrible, but you kind of make sure that you add a bit of value by finding some like really glaring vulnerabilities as well. Systems that are vulnerable to field usable cloning attacks are slowly disappearing. Basically, as buildings get replaced or refurbished, they tend to put in a new card system. It is a bit disturbing that there are integrators still doing new HID procs installations. So this, you can't discount this as an attack vector, but it will kind of slowly go away. There's ongoing research into more attacks, and for all I know, tomorrow someone will find some sweet 0-day and like DesFire or encrypted cards, and we'll go back to cloning everyone's cards, but it is becoming less and less viable. Right, so now we get into some kind of interesting stuff, which is attacking door control wiring. And there's three ways I'll talk about for doing this. You can go after the card reader wiring. You can directly add or remove power to door security components. And you can do some kind of crafty things around the door control logic, which is mostly manipulating the hardware that's responsible for things like the request to exit functionality. So I won't go too in depth with RFID wiring attacks. I believe this is something that Alex's talk this morning probably covered. And the Spark Notes is that many older systems use a protocol called Weekend on the wire. It's clear text. The card IDs just go in a very human understandable format, well, once it's decoded over the wire. And there's commercially available tools like this little guy here, the BLE key. You gain access to the wiring, you tap it with that, and you can just capture, replay. It's very clean. But that's really against legacy systems like HID procs. It's very elegant, but again, vulnerable installations are decreasing. Part of that is because modern card systems actually use cryptography between the readers and the door control systems, which effectively prevents this technique. So next is by directly providing or removing power to a door component. The most obvious is with a maglock. You take the power away and the door will open. Maglocks actually draw a little bit of juice, so the wiring for them can be quite obvious in a sort of building installation. If you can get access to a service riser in the basement somewhere, there'll usually be a large bundle of red and black wiring, and that will probably be most of the maglocks in the building. Finding out which of those many wires is the particular door you're interested in. You can do some stuff with current clamps and get real clever about it, but that's a bit of a pain. Also noteworthy is that if you do cut power to a maglock and then open the door, you'll generally cause an alert somewhere in the access control system. Now, the most common other electric door control system uses a solenoid to either unlatch or latch, or depending on whether it's fail-safe or fail-secure, an electric mortise inside the door or an electric strike installed in the door frame. And I'll explore this a little bit further with the electric mortise, because these are we find to be the more common thing you find out in the world. So this is the Assa Abloy Lockwood 3570. These are pretty common in commercial installations. They usually take a plain old oval lock cylinder. They can be populated with anything from a very cheap lock to a very exotic one. But we're not too interested in kind of the mechanical part of the locking. It's the electric part we care about. So here's the wiring diagram. It's probably too small for you to read. At this stage, we're just interested in pins 1 and 2. These guys over here on the plug, red and black. Like, standards for wiring are great. Make it so easy to find stuff like this on a wall. So pins 1 and 2, they are the common 0 volts, which is basically ground, and it's incorrectly spelled on this which is kind of funny because it did come straight from SA Abloy, the solenoid positive. There's several other wires that do some interesting things in the door, like this. They sense the state of the door and the latch and the lock. I'll talk about them a little more in a moment. So this, at a super simplified level, is like what's happening when you unlock a door using a solenoid. The door controller decides that the door is allowed to open, it closes a relay, this puts 12 volts DC across the solenoid, and the door unlatches. So what if we get access to the door wiring, maybe in the tiled ceiling directly above the door, and we provide the solenoid with our own 12 volt power source, for example, from like a power brick or a little battery pack? Okay, so what we've done here is we've had a rummage around in the ceiling by the door, and we found a junction box containing a bunch of door wiring. And opening the junction box exposed a whole bunch of joins, and I've gone super high tech and just jammed a drawing pin through a couple of these. I've then connected this to a 12 volt power source with some interesting results. Any moment now. Super high tech wiring tap stuff. This is more NSA stuff. So you'll note the card reader stays red, but the door has actually unlatched. The solenoid's been triggered, and the door is able to be opened. Now, noteworthy here, I don't have sound unfortunately, but basically the door access control system was like, something is drastically wrong. Like I haven't had a request to exit, I haven't had a valid card, anything like that, but the solenoid's been powered and that door's come unlatched and then now the door's opened. And so it triggered a forced door alert and the card reader started furiously beeping and all that kind of thing. So, you could get around that by you've got access to the wiring, so you could get around that by bridging out the wires that do the door state sensing and maybe cutting some more wires if the client doesn't mind you cutting a few wires, that kind of thing. Let's jump over here. The door's open, but it's not super clean. There's also risks associated with this because if the door wiring is a little bit inconsistent or you just somehow get the wrong wires or something like that, there is a real risk that you'll just pump 12 volts across something that should never ever see 12 volts and some bad stuff might happen either in the door or in the access control system. And besides all that, there is a slightly better way. So basically, a lot of these 3570s are configured so that from the secure side, when you want to leave, you just walk up and you turn the door handle. And that's why tools like the under the door tool work against them. But I was interested that electrically, what actually happened when you turned the door handle. So looking at the 3570 wiring diagram, I figured it was basically this. Like the door controller's there, there's a micro switch in the door hub, you turn the handle, the switch closes, it shorts that pin in the controller to ground, and the door controller goes, cool, you want to leave, and it opens the door. So I got into that wiring again, and I just shorted the door sense, the hub sense wiring to ground. And nothing happened. Or at least nothing visible with the door happened. But on the door controller software, it actually knew that something weird had happened. It logged that it had been tampered with, which is probably bad if there's like a manned security desk. And so this told me that it wasn't actually looking for a short circuit. So I had a bit more of a dig into this. And there's actually this extra little bonus bit of circuitry that's installed in the back edge of the door, and this interfaces between the wiring of the door controller and the wiring inside the mortise. And interestingly, while the mortise itself does indeed go short circuit when you turn the handle, this little PCB kind of changes things up a bit by introducing a couple of resistors. So when the handle is turned, which is going to be that one, the door controller sees 4,700 ohms in this particular instance between the input and what's called the common. So the common is basically a ground for all sensing on that door. When the handle is not turned over here, it sees 9,400 ohms. So basically what's happening is that when the micro switch closes, a second 9,400 ohm resistor is introduced in parallel with the existing one, which halves the resistance seen by the door controller, and it gives you an ability to be like, something's changed, but you're not allowed short circuits. But since we have access to the wiring, we can introduce our own resistor to the circuit in parallel. And to make this a little bit easier, I mashed together a very sort of rudimentary little tool. So this is really simple. It's a momentary push button switch up here. It's wired with a 10,000 ohm resistor wrapped up in electrical tape there. I use 10,000 ohms because these door systems apparently have like massive fudge factor, which is presumably to allow for like wiring losses and things like that. And I put two different sorts of ends on. There's hooked ones and probes, but that's really just to allow attacks against different kinds of door wiring. The second switch up there just shorts the two probes together, and that's just for if I do want to jump or something inside inside some door wiring. So here it is in practice. Again, I simply jammed a couple of drawing pins into a joint in the wiring, and then I attached the hooked probes to those drawing pins. Right, I'm not 100% if you'll be able to see, but over here we've got the card reader, and you'll see that the LED on the card reader has actually just turned green. When I push the button, the door controller has basically seen a request to exit event from inside that door. It has set everything to happy, and it has unlatched the door. Open, very clean. I'm going to improve this tool into a bit more of a field-ready thing in the future. I'll package it up nicely and have some kind of switching between modes of operation, because at the moment, if you like mash the wrong button, you get a short circuit and bad things might happen. And the long-term goal would be to have it possibly as something that you could install as like a type of implant. You might be able to install it during the night, but you know that the area on the other side has an alarm during the night, so you can only access it during the day. You want to do an authentic looking entry. You have this thing in the roof that's triggered by Bluetooth. You rock up with an app on your phone, you push a button, the door unlatches. To any observer, everything looks clean, but you've actually just kind of popped this door. It's kind of just extending on the different ways that we can get through a door. And really at the moment, it's just another way to attack a door that I have quite a lot of uninterrupted time in front of. So as you've seen, it results in a very clean opening of the door. There's very minimal trace left in the door access system. All that's left in the logs is that someone exited that door. And because that's a kind of like informational level event without someone actually going and carefully trawling through the door access logs, it's unlikely that someone's going to notice it. It is slightly destructive because you need to gain access to the door wiring, and there is some risk of damaging either the door components or the controller itself. And as I mentioned, this technique requires that you have a bit of time that you can actually sit in front of that door uninterrupted. You can get up in the roof, you can get at the wiring, and you can work on things for a while. And the mitigation for this is very simple. It's basically just ensure that an attacker can't get at your door wiring. Cool, so that's about it. I hope you've learned something new here. If you want to keep up with my latest mischief, I'm on Twitter, InfoSnackNZ. I want to give a quick shout out to the crew at Aura. I love working with you crazy people. And he's not here, but to Michael Maynard for all the help he's given the Aura crew with our lockpicking over the last year or so. Unfortunately, I have to run off and get a flight. Otherwise, I'd love to like chat with people, because especially other people doing this kind of work, like I love the war stories. If you want to get in touch, Twitter DM's the best option. And we're always kind of hiring. Even if you're just interested in what this career kind of entails and just want to know a bit more, like feel free to hit me up. Cool. End. May have time for a couple of questions, like 2 minutes for questions. Anyone? Somebody? Anybody? Down the back in the middle. The question was, how often do you find like a read switch or something will trigger when you do these kind of attacks? I'm going to assume you mean kind of there's something sensing the state of the door. A lot of doors that are using like an electric mortise, they have that built in. Next time you open a electric controlled door, you'll often notice there's a little circle in the door frame just by the strike plate, and that's usually a magnet, and there'll be a magnetic reed switch in the plate. So just about every door that's using a mortise will have a reed. Also, often you do see the little reeds at the very top of the door. Very common to see them, quite uncommon to see doors that do anything when the conditions are breached. And that's kind of down to an installation thing. The standalone reeds are commonly for an intrusion detection system, your standard burglar alarm. If the burglar alarm's on and the door has a reed, it's probably a bad idea to open that door. The ones that are tied to the access control systems, we've forced doors in sites that had a manned security desk and the card reader didn't even start beeping. Like that, there would have been a forced door alert, I'm almost certain, and it just went off to like dev null. I don't know, it just disappeared. Anyone else? Clippus. Bolts. Oh, like hinges and stuff. The hinge pins. No, I've never needed to. It's in there. It's a very low tech attack. If you have external hinges and they're not security hinges where the hinge pin is welded at both ends, you just get a nail punch and you punch the pin out and then you open the door backwards. I've never had to do it. It's totally a viable attack. Rehanging the door might be a massive pain in the ass, and that's something I kind of try to avoid because I'm lazy. Yeah, it's another one to have up your sleeve. Absolutely. Anyone else? Cool, I'm just going to sneak away then. Thank you.
Thanks very much. All right, we're going to transition to our next speaker in the next few minutes. So I'd say probably just keep sitting and we'll be back with you in the next 2-3 minutes.